During the 1700s, the city of Boston played a key role in the start of the American Revolution. The city saw important moments in history that led the colonists to rebel against British rule. From violent clashes like the Boston Massacre, protests like the Boston Tea Party, and the Battle of Bunker Hill, Boston became a center of rebellion. And in this city, there lived important patriots that helped advocate the fight for independence. For years, Britain had been passing tax laws on the colonies. These included the Stamp and Township Acts. The colonists had no say in the passing of these new laws and were angered by them. But perhaps none of the colonists were more angered than the citizens of Boston. "No taxation without representation" became a popular slogan among the citizens. To enforce these tax laws, thousands of British soldiers were sent to Boston in 1768. This only made matters worse, as the citizens of Boston saw the soldiers as an occupying force. Citizens would clash with the soldiers, making tensions worse. On March 5, 1770, the tensions between the citizens and soldiers reached a boiling point. That night, a crowd of colonists gathered near the custom house, where soldiers were stationed. The crowd began to taunt the soldiers and threw snowballs, ice, and rocks at them. Tensions escalated, and a soldier fired his gun. Then more soldiers began shooting into the crowd. This resulted in the deaths of 5 men. This tragic event outraged many people in the colonies. Samuel Adams and Paul Revere referred to the event as a massacre. Samuel Adams used the massacre to show how cruel the British were. His cousin, John Adams, defended the British soldiers in court to show that justice was needed, even in times of anger. Most of the soldiers were found not guilty. But the massacre fueled hatred against the British rule and brought the colonies closer together in their desire for independence. In May 1773, Britain passed another tax law called the Tea Act. This new law gave the British East India Company control over tea sales in the colonies. The colonists were angered and saw this as Britain controlling the economy. They began smuggling Dutch tea to avoid paying the tax. On the night of December 16, 1773, the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams and John Hancock, dressed as Native Americans and boarded 3 British ships in the Boston harbor. They proceeded to dump over 300 crates of tea into the water. This protest angered the British government, resulting in harsher laws to punish Boston. The port was closed to tighten their control over the city. Instead of breaking the colonists' spirit, these actions united them in their potential fight for freedom. John Adams, one of the most important leaders of the Revolution, was born near Boston and was deeply involved in the fight for independence. His beliefs were written into a pamphlet called Thoughts on Government, outlining ideas of republicanism, individual rights, and government laws. Even though he defended the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre, he was still a dedicated patriot. He believed everyone had a right to a fair trial, regardless of public sentiment. Adams was a key member of the Continental Congress, which brought together leaders from the colonies to discuss their future. He helped write and push for the Declaration of Independence, making him one of the most influential figures in American history. His dedication to independence and his role as a leader would later make him the second president of the United States. As tensions with Britain continued to rise, John Hancock and Samuel Adams became key leaders in preparing the colonies for open rebellion. Both men had long been active in organizing protests and acts of defiance, but by the early 1770s, they understood that political resistance alone would not be enough. The British government's increasing control over Boston convinced them that the colonies would need to defend themselves if they hoped to win their freedom. John Hancock, one of Boston's wealthiest citizens, used his resources to support the Patriot cause. He had already suffered personally from British trade restrictions, with his ships often seized or heavily taxed. Hancock knew that economic protests could only go so far, and physical resistance might be necessary. Samuel Adams, a fiery leader of the Sons of Liberty, agreed. As one of the most vocal critics of British rule, Adams had organized many protests, including the Boston Tea Party. He was convinced that the British would not back down peacefully and that the colonies would need to fight for their rights. Together, Hancock and Adams began stockpiling weapons, ammunition, and gunpowder in secret locations throughout Massachusetts, particularly in the town of Concord. This was a bold move because under British law, it was illegal for the colonists to gather arms without permission. Their decision to prepare for violence was not made lightly. They saw the British government as an oppressive force that ignored colonial rights and refused to listen to their grievances. For them, the revolution was not just about taxes or trade. It was about the basic right to self-governance. The British soon learned of the hidden stockpiles and saw them as a direct threat. General Thomas Gage, the British commander in Boston, received orders to disarm the colonists by seizing these weapons. This set the stage for the confrontation that would spark the war. When Paul Revere learned that General Gage was planning to dispatch British troops to Lexington and Concord to seize the weapon stockpiles, he knew he had to act quickly to warn Hancock and Adams. To signal the British approach, the Old North Church in Boston displayed 2 lanterns. One if the British were coming by land, and 2 if they were coming by sea. As the lanterns lit up, Revere set off on his famous ride. He rode through the night, traveling along the countryside, knocking on doors and alerting residents that the British are coming. Revere was joined by fellow patriot William Dawes, and together they covered significant ground, warning militias and encouraging them to prepare for action. Their ride was instrumental in mobilizing the colonial forces. Thanks to their efforts, the militias were ready to confront the British troops when they arrived at Lexington and Concord the next morning, leading to the first battles of the Revolutionary War. At Lexington, a small group of militia awaited the British troops. When the soldiers arrived, they ordered the militia to lay down their arms and disperse. The encounter resulted in the first shots of the Revolutionary War, with the colonial forces suffering a few casualties. The British continued to Concord, where they faced a larger militia. This time, the Patriots successfully pushed back the British, forcing them to retreat to Boston. These battles marked a significant turning point, motivating the colonial resistance and signaling the start of war. After the midnight ride and the victorious battles at Lexington and Concord, the fight for Boston continued. One of the most important battles was the one known as Bunker Hill. Although it is called the Battle of Bunker Hill, most of the fighting actually happened on nearby Breed's Hill, overlooking Boston. The British planned to take control of the hills around Boston to gain a strategic advantage, but the colonial militia moved quickly to defend the high ground. Under the command of Colonel William Prescott, the Patriots built fortifications on Breed's Hill to stop the British advance. The battle that followed was fierce and bloody. Though the British eventually captured the hill, it came at a high cost. They suffered heavy losses, with over 1,000 British soldiers killed or wounded. The colonists lost the battle, but their bravery proved that they could stand up to the British Army, which gave them confidence and hope for future battles. The Battle of Bunker Hill proved that the colonists were willing to fight for their freedom, even against a powerful enemy. It also convinced many people, both in the colonies and in Britain, that the conflict was going to be long and difficult. Following the battle, the British solidified their control over Boston, which was now surrounded by colonial forces. The situation soon spiraled into a full-scale siege. The Continental Army, now under the command of George Washington, sought to cut off British supplies and reinforcements, leading to a prolonged standoff. This siege lasted until March 1776, when Washington's forces, having fortified Dorchester Heights with cannons captured from Fort Ticonderoga, positioned themselves to threaten the British. Faced with the threat of bombardment and a direct assault, the British evacuated Boston on March 17th, leaving the city in control of the Continental Army.